Hello and welcome to another mini painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm just going to be doing some basing for Star Wars Legion. For my first course set, I decided to make sort of this desert base, and I think it's pretty cool, and I just wanted to kind of show people how I did it if they ever want to try something very similar. I'm going to be showing it on the speeder bikes here because those bases are a little bit bigger and have a little bit more real estate, but I'll also show briefly on some stormtroopers as well. For the speeder bike, the most obvious thing first is you got to glue the little peg that holds the speeder bike up onto the base first. Basically try to center it best as possible, and of course make sure that the figure is pointing in the right direction. Next up, after letting that dry, I measured out some big rocks for the base. Basically you want these big rocks to kind of fit in between the sight lines as best as possible. If they overlap a little, it's probably not a huge deal, as long as you can kind of still see the sight lines in the end product. I just used regular old tan bark for this, and basically I just took a scalpel and other things and just kind of cut them up to fit. Tan bark's a little big on these bases, but I kind of wanted to go for that effect, at least on the speeder bikes, because I kind of wanted to look like they're about to enter some sort of desert canyon or something. You could, of course, just cut them down to really small sizes and just deal with small boulders and slight rocks rather than a big giant rock like I did. Next up, we're actually going to put terrain paint onto the bases themselves. I use AK Terrain's Desert Sand and Sandy Desert. Desert Sand's kind of a yellowy desert, and Sandy Desert's a bit more red. I think they work well together just to kind of give a little bit of variety to the base, but really you could just use Desert Sand, or vice versa, you could just use Sandy Desert if you want more of a reddish tone to your sand, and that's all you would need. These are basic acrylic terrain paint kind of things, so you could water them down if you want, kind of experiment with them. I didn't do a lot of experimentation on this kind of base just because there's not a lot of real estate to really work with here, and we're not doing some big fancy terrain kind of things. First of all, on the sides I used the Sandy Desert, more red, because that's where my rocks are going to go. I want the terrain around those rocks to look a little bit more red. As the terrain is drying, one thing you can do to add a little bit more texture is to take an old brush and kind of just stamp into the terrain just a little bit. Don't use a new brush for this. And doing that, you can add some slight valleys or just anything you kind of want to the terrain. And then just down the middle, I use the desert sand to give kind of this yellowish trench. Now, one thing to do, especially in Star Wars Legion, since they are actually important for the game, is to make sure that you carve the sight lines out. And just to show a little bit of how I did this for stormtroopers as well, I basically did sort of the same thing. I picked a small area and used the redder sand in that area because I'm probably going to put a rock or something. And then the rest was all just the yellow sand. A big reason for doing this for stormtroopers is actually you can have a pretty easy way to tell difference between squads by having maybe just a rock or something on the terrain versus your other troopers who might just have a clean sort of sandy base and no other sort of distinguishing features. That's what I was going for, so that you could just look straight at the bases and be able to tell the difference between the two squads without doing any sort of fancy other things to the base, like maybe coloring the rim red or anything along those lines. Then while this terrain's still drying, you want it somewhat dried but not fully dried. You want to start putting your rocks on. Your smaller rocks, if you use any pebbles or anything like I did, you can probably just put those into the base and the terrain should just dry right around it and hold them pretty steady. You could, of course, add some super glue. For my bigger rocks, my tan bark, I definitely use some super glue and just push them into the base. That'll keep them held much stronger into the base. Same thing with any rocks you put on your stormtroopers. You could probably super glue them or just put them into the base as it's drying, depending on how big it is, and it should hold pretty well as long as you handle it. Next up, I did just some minor sort of painting to add a little bit more color to the rocks or to color it to make it sort of match. For the most part, I just used Agrax Earthshade oil for this. I used it over the tan bark to make it a little bit darker. Some of the terrain itself, I used it on there just to kind of add a little bit more color here and there. This particular trooper, I put sort of a valley of more dark sand in there, but I sort of changed my mind after a while and put some yellow sand back on top and then kind of redid it. But nonetheless, you could do things like that. Just add sort of different color variations to your sand, however you really want. Kind of play around with it and see how it works best for you. Another thing I did is any sort of pebbles or rocks I used, those were gray, and I just used a brownish red and went over those in sort of the brown red color just to make them sort of match. I did a dry brush of this brown red too on the tan bark, just a few other areas, just to add a little color variety. It's not hugely noticeable just on basic tan bark, but after adding some Agrax Earthshade, darkening everything, you should see some slight color variation. And then finally I did one more dry brush, took that brownish red, mixed it with a slightly lighter color, and just kind of did another slight dry brush on certain areas of the rocks to give it, again, a little bit more color variation. And that's how I did my bases. Feel free to sort of take this tutorial and kind of play around with it. A lot of the things I did here probably aren't exactly perfect, but these are pretty small bases, so there's only so much you can really do. But you can do all sorts of different things than what I did. You can color the sand actually to make it look even more yellow or, you know, bright white in certain areas. You could color the rocks completely differently. Go for a different desert rock color. Definitely for these bases, don't feel bad about trying to experiment or just try something different, or just to see kind of what happens when you put a wash here, wash there, or if you want to try dry brushing the sand itself, you could do all sorts of different little things to these bases and color them in all sorts of different ways.